it's all about the demand, and the value and the opportunity is there for the retailers to significantly reduce emissions, significantly reduce their environmental impact of the food system that serves us all. And really, it's helping them understand the potential of what could actually be achieved really quite affordably is really the key here. And then they can provide the price signals, and when they value that generates the pull down the chain, and so it can be worth going out there and planting beans this spring.
No matter where you are in the world, global markets tend to favour supply from the lowest cost producer. But could this be about to change? Increasingly, the environmental cost of inputs is being factored in, both at a national policy level and within company sustainability targets. Ireland is not alone in making the case for lower carbon grains and animal rations, with the UK also making significant progress to make the case for replacing imported soya with homegrown alternatives. You are listening to the latest episode of the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. If you enjoyed the series, we'd really appreciate it if you could follow the podcast and leave a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts from. Last week, I visited an agricultural grain drying and storage specialist, McArthur BDC in Lincolnshire, who are currently developing a new bean processing facility. While there, I caught up with John McArthur to discuss the range of projects the company is involved in, from installing large-scale grain storage systems to processing beans for inclusion in poultry rations.
So McArthur BDC, we design, we build and we maintain grain drying and processing systems in the UK and Ireland.
And when you mean grain processing systems, dryers, stuff to load grain into sheds, out of sheds, that kind of thing?
Yep, so it's everything from your drying and your storage, whether it's silo storage or flat store storage, through to your primary processing, so cleaning, separating crops, colour sorting, the kind of things that you might have happen on a farm premises or at the mill.
So it's everything from the big grain silos to elevators to, all that end of it to the intakes, all that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. That's it.
Just in terms of, you mentioned kind of the grain processing side of the house, is that everything from drying to I suppose sieving and separating grain, or is it a bit more complicated than that?
Yeah, so it started there, but in the past few years, it's kind of evolved, and we've started doing some processing for combinable crops, particularly pulses like field beans and peas, and looking how we can add value to those crops for animal feed.
Okay. Before we get into there, it's a relatively, I'm visiting here today in the UK, and it seems to be a relatively large company. You design kind of grain stores right from the start all the way through to building in them and maintaining them the far side, that'd be right?
Mm-hmm. That's right. So we started just with simple standalone dryers, but over the kind of the last 10 years or so, we've been taking on larger and larger projects. We don't manufacture any of the individual pieces of equipment ourselves, but we're kind of an integrator. So we're understanding what the customer's wanting to achieve, looking at the scale and the standard to which they're needing to do things. And so we can get the right types of equipment, the right kind of layouts. So we can essentially give their business the system that it needs to do the job.
Okay. And that obviously can be integrated into existing kind of agri-merchant stores and that kind of stuff. You're tacking on more complicated structures, I suppose, onto the side of it, are you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, quite often we can be doing extensions to existing plants, and every now and then you get really lucky and you have a beautiful greenfield site where you can do everything from the start and have it just how you want it.
Okay, your little playground, you can build what you want, kind of thing in there, right?
That's it. It's nice when you get those opportunities.
Okay, and you mentioned then you're involved in the processing side of it, so kind of bringing grain on a little bit further. You might describe some of the types of equipment that you supply for that.
Mm-hmm. It all started actually working with one of our existing suppliers, and we were looking at grain roasting, and the roasting is found to improve the protein quality for ruminants, and so through the roasting that led us to a couple of other processes such as dehulling or decortication as well, and both of those really work particularly well on pulses.
Okay, and that's, I suppose, a big reason why we're out chatting to you today is really around that pulses bit. And you've been heavily involved not just in supplying the equipment, but you got a bit more involved in research and I suppose helping figure out how the industry might work.
Exactly. So, in wanting to understand kind of what was the nutritional benefit of these processes, so we could so we could actually understand what the opportunity was with the equipment, we got involved in some funded research, some DEFRA funded research in 2023, and we're 3 years into a project called the NCS project, which is specifically looking at expanding the pulse production area and how those pulses will be used in the feed supply chain in the UK. And that subsequently led to a further project, which is looking at pulses and processed pulses in dairy supply chain specifically.
Okay, and you've been telling us quite a bit about that research today, and I think some of it's particularly interesting. And the bit that you tried to look at in more detail was around the poultry side of the house. You might describe what you were trying to do with the beans and how you were trying to integrate them.
Mm-hmm. We've been really fortunate in the project to work alongside SRUC and also ABN, who'd a large independent feed manufacturer in the UK. And we've really been able to, through research experiments at SRUC and then commercial trials, understand what processes we can do post-harvest to the pulses to maximize their nutritive value, and then how far that enables us to substitute soy in poultry diets. We've done research work in broilers and in layers, and both showed really positive results. And what we're seeing now in the commercial trials is those results are carrying forward and been replicated at scale.
So, as you mentioned, you were trying to, I suppose, displace soya out of the system. And we'll come back to that in a second. It's around, I suppose, it's carbon and all the other kind of issues around soya. But you might tell me, what were you comparing soya to in terms of the beans?
So what we were looking at with the beans is they don't have the same nutritional profile of soy. We know that the crude protein is lower, but particularly with the monogastric rationing, we're looking in more detail at the amino acid profile. And so it was looking at how we could improve the digestibility of the beans. And so the removal of the hulls, which contained a fiber and tannins and a couple of other anti-nutritive factors, and also the roasting has an additional reduction in some of the common ANFs. We're trying to see how we can maximize the availability of the nutrition in the bean through that post-harvest processing to kind of really never going to match, but to improve upon what soy is delivering.
Okay, and some of the results that you showed us when you compared soya to feeding whole beans and feeding dehulled beans, and then the last bit was dehulled and roasted beans. Mm-hmm. What were the main or the key results that you found in that in terms of feed conversion ratios and that kind of thing?
Yeah, so thinking about broilers in the first instance, and really importantly, what we found that the overall performance was maintained, and actually the beans in several in several products actually performed a little bit stronger than the soya controls. So we know that we're getting the right performance within at a set number of days. What we then could see was that our feed conversion ratios in the experimental work that we did were slightly better than the soy, which was a little bit unexpected, but we think we know that was something to do with the underlying kind of strong digestibility data for the beans that we used. Taking that forward, what we saw is up to a 68% reduction in soybean meal could be achieved, and that was on the 30% inclusion rate of dehulled toasted beans. And that also ran to a 35% reduction in the carbon emissions associated with that feed, obviously delivering this comparable performance.
And so that's experimental, which is all well and fine, and a commercial grower will say, well, great and all that. Did you roll that out a little bit further out to commercial flocks?
Yeah, so that's inclusion levels in commercial flocks now have been up to in the region of 10%. So we're delivering significant emissions reductions, and we're maintaining kind of a level of performance that is on track for on track for where it needs to be. And I think when you think about what the nutritionists thought might be possible at the start of the project and where we are now, we're working at a level that's kind of a bit beyond expectation. So there's a real confidence and a bit of excitement about what's actually been possible with the processing.
And, when you put that all together, I don't know a lot about poultry, to be fair, but I do know is that the margins are relatively slim in it. So if it's too expensive, they probably won't use it. But is there a bigger driver behind all of this to try and use it? And you did mention carbon earlier.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, without a doubt, where the commodity markets are right now, in terms of just cost per unit crude protein, or even cost per unit digestible lysine, beans are dearer. Okay, and that's without a doubt. But what the beans also deliver is very low emissions compared to soya. Soya obviously has challenges associated with its production, particularly in South America, surrounding deforestation and land use change, and that weighs very heavily on the emissions. Now, many retailers are very conscious of their Scope 3 emissions now, and there's going to be a real move to making active progress towards reducing those. And the emissions that any retailer control are the ones that are within their supply chain. So before we get into the realms of offsetting and what might be done there, there's big opportunities within the supply chains to reduce emissions. Now, when you factor in the value of that emissions reduction that the beans can deliver, it really levels the playing field with soya.
Okay, and you presented some data there around, putting it all into context in terms of in economic value. You might maybe explain that rationale to me.
Mm-hmm. When you attach an economic value to the carbon, and you offset that against the cost of the increasing cost of feed, where carbon's valued in the region of £240 a tonne, which is a kind of a UK measure for the social value of carbon. What you see very large positive returns from the reduction in emissions. But £240 a tonne is way above kind of EU ETS and kind of common offsetting values. Yep. If we looked at something around about the £50 a tonne mark, you're looking at a kind of a 4-to-1 return still, on the bean-based diet rather than the soy.
So that's when you're I suppose, offsetting the extra cost of feed on one side by using the beans, because it is a bit more expensive, but taking into account the much lower carbon on the other side and putting the value on that carbon. Mm-hmm. Still 4-to-1, still a fantastic.
Absolutely. And really at that 4-to-1, at around that £50 per tonne of carbon, you've actually got the ability to inset emissions reductions into the food system, into the supply chain at less than the cost of offsets.
Okay. And in Ireland at the moment, we have a really good system to be able to capture the data around carbon. It's called AgNav. But there's a bit of a reluctance by tillage farmers to sign up to it because they can't see the immediate benefit. Given what you were after doing, in terms of this project, do you see this as something that, look, you mightn't like it, but it's something that has to be done and eventually you're going to get some bit of value back out of it?
Yeah, I think without the data and without the proof, displacement of imported protein with homegrown protein is just a nice story. And it's the data and that actually gives the facts that supply chains can then account. And these are multinational companies, and they have very specific ways in which they must account these Scope 3 emissions and the potential of those reductions. And without actual proof, it's very difficult. And what I would say is that faba beans are generally the carbon footprint that is associated with them in databases such as GFLI is far higher than the actual carbon associated with their production. That's something that the NCS project has really brought to bear. In reality, the carbon footprint of a ton of faba beans is probably 50% of what the book value would be. So actually having the real data in hand is a further benefit extra over the GFLI data.
You get to have that, yeah. Finally, John, I suppose, look, as our conversation has gone today, as we're chatting about various different projects, this in particular, you've really been very strong on there needs to be a market pull for all this. There's no point in producing stuff if you've no market. And you've been attacking that, I suppose, maybe slightly differently to Ireland.
Yeah, well, we've through the project, we've been in a lot of discussions with retailers and producers, particularly kind of in the poultry sector, be they broilers or layers. And I think they're very conscious of the Scope 3 commitments that their businesses have made and that they are committed to achieving. I think the commitment is there, but the ideas and necessarily the ways by which that will be achieved is still unclear. And I think that in the UK, with the market price of beans right now, it's not something that can be pushed by telling farmers it's a fantastic idea for their farm enterprise to go out and plant beans this spring. Purely economically, that's quite a hard sell. And even for a livestock farmer to swap soy, which is quite cheap at the moment, compared to beans, to swap soy protein for homegrown protein, and the feed mills will of course be producing what the farmers require. It's all about the demand, and the value and the opportunity is there for the retailers to significantly reduce emissions, significantly reduce their environmental impact of the food system that serves us all. And really, it's helping them understand the potential of what could actually be achieved really quite affordably. Is really the key here. And then they can provide the price signals, and when they value that generates the pull down the chain, and so it can be worth going out there and planting beans this spring.
John, listen, thanks very much for that. Delighted to meet your brilliant factory over here. Thanks very much.
No problem, Michael. Thank you.
Okay, so that's it for this episode, and my thanks to John for joining me on the show. So as usual, if you enjoyed the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague. And as always, rate, review and follow on Apple or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy, thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.